Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism discussion group. This year's program is It's Complicated, and through these sessions, we seek to reclaim the phrase It's Complicated as a tool for unraveling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. Without further delay, we would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Rebekah Hodgkinson. Rebekah is a DPhil student in the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. Her project is a collaborative PhD completed in partnership with the National Trust, and she recently submitted her thesis at the end of December 2023. Rebekah's topic today will be Constructing the Past and the Present, the National Trust and British Colonialism. Welcome, Rebekah. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be part of this seminar series, so thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to it. So today I'm going to be talking mostly about the National Trust's history, but to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about some developments over the last few years, which I'll come back to at the end of the talk to kind of tie everything together. So just to check that you can hear me okay before I start?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So I began my PhD in October 2019, and with us going into lockdown in March 2020, COVID has obviously had a huge impact on my project and what I've been able to access in order to carry out my research. But another really big influence on my research which is particularly relevant for this seminar series, is the so-called culture wars, and specifically the targeting of the National Trust by right-wing MPs and print media from the summer of 2020 onwards. So the history I'm going to detail in this talk is really relevant for what's been going on with the National Trust over the past few years, but I want to start by saying a little bit about that before I go into some of my research findings. So without further ado, I'll get started. So I'm assuming that most people who've signed up to attend this talk will have followed some of the media coverage of this, but for anyone who doesn't know, the National Trust received a lot of newspaper coverage and criticism, which began in 2020. So this emerged during a period in which the Trust was undergoing a restructure, which attracted some media attention, particularly after the Times reported on a leaked strategy document that was claimed to show that the Trust's intention was to shift its focus away from history and culture by repurposing some of its properties. In the same month, the Trust posted a Twitter thread to mark UNESCO's Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. The thread on Twitter detailed some examples of objects in National Trust collections, which have some connection to the transatlantic slave trade, and this received press coverage based on replies to the tweets, the gist of which was basically that this was inappropriate for the Trust to be talking about or representing a one-sided view of history in some way. And these two moments have really shaped the way that the Trust has been talked about ever since. The implication was that at the same time that the Trust was acknowledging ties between its collections and historic slavery and implicitly criticising Britain's role in that transatlantic slave trade, it was looking to move away from its role as a custodian of national heritage. So in September 2020, the Trust published its interim report on the connections between colonialism and properties now in the care of the National Trust, including links to historic slavery, and received similar commentary, which quickly grew and saw a lot more coverage. The report essentially just summed up connections between 93 of the Trust's historic properties and colonialism and slavery. This ranged from financial ties and political links to specific connections with individuals coming to Britain from different parts of the empire. And immediately there was a backlash that was unprecedented in its scale. The Trust has faced similar criticism for talking about slavery in the past, particularly in 2007 during the bicentenary of abolition of the slave trade, in which it faced criticism again for talking about these things as though they were an inappropriate topic for the Trust to be discussing. And so perhaps because this report was the first systematic survey of colonial links, as well as the political context in which it was being published, this saw a much bigger reaction. So in 2020, 3 parliamentary debates took place regarding the National Trust in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, and the Telegraph and the Spectator in particular have published hundreds of articles ever since, undermining the expertise of the Trust and often publishing misleading statements about its initiatives ever since. In the House of Commons, questions were asked about how much money the National Trust had spent on producing the interim report. This was presumably to suggest that the Trust could have been misusing public money at a time when it was under scrutiny over the redundancies it was making. In each parliamentary debate, it had to be reiterated that the National Trust is in fact independent of government. In the House of Lords, Nigel Huddleston, at that time the Under-Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, noted that the Trust was having to draw on its reserves at that time and use government assistance. So, it was not wasting money on this research. The Trust is a statutory body, and some MPs called for a government investigation into its operations as a result of the publication of this report. But Huddleston recommended that the Charity Commission, in its role as regulator, should police it instead. At no point in these discussions was the Trust's status as an independent research organisation mentioned. This would surely leave no doubt that commissioning and performing research on its own collections is definitely within the Trust's remit, and something that it has always done before it even gained that status, which I believe was in 2019. So there's a kind of sense that the Trust was wrong to be doing research at all, or certainly to be researching this specific aspect of history. Even though in other areas of its work, research seems an obviously accepted thing for it to be doing, in the world of natural conservation and things like that. But what really comes out of reading the parliamentary debates is that the report was framed as partisan and presented as going against the Trust's mission as a charity. The Trust was accused of creating the report in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, which were ongoing at the time. But it had actually been commissioned in 2019 and was rooted in the Colonial Countryside project, which began in 2018. The Common Sense Group, a group of Conservative MPs formed in 2020, signed a letter to the Telegraph in November 2020, suggesting that the National Trust was coloured by cultural Marxist dogma, colloquially known as the woke agenda, and that a clique of powerful, privileged liberals were trying to rewrite British history. This was in keeping with other developments, which had seen the government become increasingly vocal about the supposed culture warriors seeking to represent the British past unfairly. In the spring of 2021, newspapers began quoting a group named Restore Trust, claiming to be a grassroots organisation of Trust members upset by what the Trust was doing. Restore Trust has since gained a lot of attention and has been found to be a private company, not a group of National Trust members. And it's been linked to 55 Tufton Street and its associated right-wing think tanks. Restore Trust has backed particular candidates for election to the National Trust's Council in its last 3 AGMs and published articles criticising the Trust on its website. All of these different developments have happened in a much wider context of attacks on academics and heritage professionals working on projects relating to the history of empire and particularly slavery. But the Trust has become the centre of debate and faced a targeted campaign. And in particular, Corinne Fowler, among the other authors of the report, have faced huge amounts of press attention and received abuse and threats. In 2021, the Charity Commission demonstrated that the Trust had not gone against its charitable purposes, but media coverage has continued and a kind of wider string of criticism against the Trust has ensued. And a lot of this debate centres on questions about the Trust's purpose as an organisation, and as I said, its mission as a charity specifically. So quite quickly, in summer 2020 or the early autumn, the Trust's capability to fulfil what was understood to be its mission was seen as lacking. And what I'm interested in partly is about the idea of what is the Trust's core purpose and how that changes over time. So in terms of how I'm contributing to this seminar series and to the complication of this debate, I'm interested in how the Trust came to be seen as representing preservation, as being this vision of the past suspended in aspic, unchanging, and not being able to be interpreted in any way. It's just there as it is. And Restore Trust in particular suggests that National Trust houses should be preserved as they were. And this is a really interesting concept when you look at how country houses were first being preserved by the National Trust and the kind of practices which were employed. Which I will talk about further on later in the talk. But first, I want to go back to the founding of the Trust and give a little bit of a quick history of it for anyone who is not familiar with the Trust or its history. So the National Trust is Europe's largest conservation charity. It owns vast amounts of farmland and coastline and hundreds of historic buildings, often accompanied by gardens, across England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and it has a huge fee-paying membership of 5.37 million people. It was founded in 1895 by Octavia Hill, Hardwicke Rawnsley and Robert Hunter, who were all already involved in campaigns and other efforts to preserve public access to open spaces. The founders created the National Trust specifically to create a body which would have the ability to purchase land. The open spaces movement, which they were all involved with in different ways, and other campaign groups which were fighting to maintain common land and ensure people living in cities in particular could access green spaces, could only do so much without being able to buy property outright. So the Trust provided this solution. It was created as the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest and Natural Beauty, a company which would own land and buildings and hold them in the public's interest. This is an important distinction, as the name national often suggests that it has a government affiliation, but that's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, the Trust has always been an independent body. And yeah, this core purpose is really about giving people access to places, and it's always had this dual mission of history and natural beauty. The two are obviously massively overlapping, and it's not always a helpful distinction, but it's always had this kind of twin mission. So on this slide, I'm just showing you some early examples. So the first property the Trust owned were the cliff tops at Dinas Olu, given by Fanny Talbot in 1895. And the first building that the Trust bought was Alfriston Clergy House in Alfriston. So just to give a brief overview of the Trust's history, I promise most of my slides aren't this wordy, but this is just to give you some context so that as I go through the presentation and refer to different moments, you've got a sense of kind of how the Trust developed over time and how it grew. Here you can see, obviously, it was founded in 1895, as I just explained, and in the early 1900s, it's mostly acquiring land and small historic buildings like the ones I just showed you. In 1907, the National Trust Act makes the National Trust a statutory corporation. So this gives it its properties the status of inalienability. So if somebody wants to buy National Trust land, they need permission from the government. So they're incredibly well protected. And in 1937, another National Trust Act is brought in, and this time this gives the National Trust the ability to accept larger properties. So typically at this time, this act was intended for country houses specifically, and their contents as gifts with endowments free of tax. And then carrying on, jumping ahead quite quickly, in 1946, just after the war, the National Land Fund is established as a memorial to people who lost their lives during the war. So it's intended for the kinds of purposes that the National Trust exists, to buy pieces of land or property as memorials, as I've just said. So this in particular funds a lot of the transfer of country houses to the National Trust. I'll talk a little bit more about the country houses in a bit, but this is the period in which the Trust is gaining them on a large scale and kind of doing so relatively systematically. And at that time, the leadership of the Trust becomes increasingly tied to those interests. So the Trust kind of comes to be seen as this very elite organisation, kind of supporting lots of vested landed interests and run by people who either own country houses themselves or are kind of mixing in those circles. In 1965, jumping ahead again, the Trust launches a campaign called the Neptune Project, which is to acquire unspoilt coastline across the UK and protect it from development. And during this campaign, Conrad Rawnsley, who's actually a descendant of the Trust founder Rawnsley, is brought in to help run the campaign and takes a much more kind of commercial approach than the Trust is typically doing at this time. And to cut a very long story short, because I won't have time today to talk about it, essentially falls out with the Trust based on how he's running the campaign and disagreements he has with the Trust's sort of institutional culture. So he kind of publicly criticises the Trust for being elitist and not really working in people's interests anymore, not giving people the kind of level of access to its properties, and particularly its country houses, that would have been expected. And as a result of his kind of public criticism and a campaign he launches with National Trust members, the Benson Report is commissioned and published in 1968, which saw Sir Henry Benson basically look at the National Trust as a whole and make recommendations about how it could better be run at a larger scale than it had ever been really intended to. So it was still operating at this time as a kind of small-scale amateur organisation, and in the wake of the Benson Report in the 70s and particularly the 80s, the Trust becomes much more commercial in its operations and grows hugely. So you see there between 1981 and 1990, its membership doubles to 2 million, and it's grown ever since. It's a huge organisation. Most people here probably know it quite well. I'm just providing lots of context for the talk. And it's huge, but that's basically a result of these events. So that's all kind of there to provide a little bit of context as I kind of move back and forth through the Trust's history in the rest of the talk. But now I want to shift my focus more to empire, because that's what we're here to discuss. So from its founding, the National Trust thought about the nation that it was representing and preserving the history of in quite broad terms relating to the British Empire, as you might expect, being founded in the 1890s. So here I have a quote from the National Trust's Council, writing in 1896, which says, "The Council believes that when the Trust can point to useful work done, it will be able to secure efficient support from beyond as well as from this side of the Atlantic. The work done now is done for posterity. England, without the places of historic interest or natural beauty that are continually being threatened, would be a poorer country and less likely to attract and hold the affections of her sons, who far away are colonising the waste places of the earth. The work of the Society, however humble, claims to be a work of true patriotism, and it is difficult to estimate the loss that will ensue if such work is postponed or crippled for want of means." So that's basically showing, obviously there's this clear sense that the National Trust's Council sees part of its role as being about promoting a shared sense of identity across the empire, not just in Britain. And specifically this, makes sense in the context of white settler populations in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and particularly relationships between the Trust and America, where we see this reference to the other side of the Atlantic, which I'll be talking about more later on. But so there's this sense that English or British history is not only to do with people living there, it's to do with the whole world at this point. And it's somewhere that people living in those colonies can look to for their sense of history or heritage, as we would talk about it now. And this idea is also supported by Hardwicke Rawnsley, one of the founders' suggestion that the National Trust could be a kind of, quote, patriotic league for the public good. And he said that at a lecture to the Ruskin Society of Birmingham in 1899. Ruskin had been a huge influence on the Trust, having mentored Octavia Hill. And another key figure who inspired Hill in particular was Thomas Carlyle, whose essay on heroes and heroicism is cited as the foundational text for the great man theory of history, which understands history as being explained by uniquely talented individuals who affect change on the world and who are typically white men. So this idea of focusing on so-called great men is seen in the preservation of historic houses linked to famous individuals, which is something the Trust has done lots of. And it was doing this from its early years, not just when the Country Houses scheme comes in. So here I've got a picture of Quebec House in Westerham, and this was the childhood home of General James Wolfe, who became a hero of the British Empire for his role in the colonisation of Canada, having died at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. He was widely commemorated ever since, and in the early 20th century, a statue of him was placed in the village of Westerham and his house given to the National Trust in 1917 even. And this was turned into a sort of memorial to Wolfe, as well as being seen as a place where visitors could come and learn about the empire. And this was also tied in with Canadian service in the First World War. So you can see how historic significance is being attached to contemporary events in the early 20th century as preservation is happening. So it's always in conversation with past and present in a way that maybe isn't always being appreciated in the debates going on post-2020. So for me, there's something really interesting here about how domestic interiors specifically are being preserved to memorialize these heroic individuals. and especially the kinds of items that are awarded significance. So things like cutlery they were known to have eaten with or thought to have used, and clothes they wore, as well as the kind of medals and artworks that are more obviously commemorative. So looking here across this slide, we see that from its foundation, empire has always been something that the Trust is engaged with as a concept and as an important aspect of British history as it sees it. Melanie Hall has suggested that the appeal and influence of ideas about empire and English identity, such as J.R. Seeley's 1883 Greater Britain, form a significant, this is a quote, form a significant but overlooked or even suppressed strand of thinking underpinning the formation of the National Trust. So this is increasingly understood as a really important central part of the National Trust's history, and I think really important for understanding what's going on today. So now I want to turn to an example of someone who had a huge impact on historic preservation in the early 20th century, which is Lord George Curzon. He lived from 1859 to 1925, and he's best known for his tenure as Viceroy of India between 1899 and 1905. He's remembered for his partition of Bengal in 1905, which was reversed in 1911, and for his oversight of wide-scale administrative reform in the British government in India. And the part of his administrative reform that I'm particularly interested in, and for the sake of this talk, we'll just quickly talk about, is to do with historic preservation. So Curzon was deeply invested in preservation of monuments, and he saw that explicitly as an imperial act and a crucial part of colonial governance. So he worked to ensure that Mughal monuments in particular would be better preserved in the tradition which was emerging through British preservation organisations like the National Trust and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, both of which he supported personally. But then back in England, when he returned from India, he continued to work on historic preservation campaigns. And sorry, I just forgot to point out this. One of his most famous historic monuments that he worked on was the Taj Mahal, which he oversaw a restoration of. And you can see from the picture here how significantly the gardens were changed during this restoration, which is a really interesting topic that there's been some really good research into. So I can send anyone details of that if they're interested in finding out more. But then, yes, back in England, he continues to work in preservation. This is Tattersall Castle, one of two castles that Curzon restored and later donated to the Trust in his will. He saw preservation work in England as much in terms of imperial rule as his reforms in India. So to him, historic preservation was a crucial part of colonial governance, documenting the history which had led to the formation of the British Empire. And of course, seeing that as an important part of identity as well, as I was talking about before. So I'm not going into tons of detail about his career for the sake of time today, but it's a good example of someone who was a very influential imperial administrator and statesman who was invested in historic preservation and involved with the Trust. But next I want to talk a little bit more about the National Trust's country houses scheme. So the Trust acquired its first country house, Barrington Court, in Somerset in 1907, but it wasn't until 1936 that the country houses scheme begins. And the 1937 and 1939 National Trust Acts allowed country house owners to transfer their properties to the Trust in lieu of tax. And though it was initially slow acquiring properties, it gained traction after the Second World War. So from the 1930s, publications like Country Life magazine had been promoting the country house increasingly as a core part of the nation's history, particularly based on its architectural contributions. And basically making the case that it was worthy of protection as it was in decline. At least 1,200 country houses are recorded as having been demolished in England in the 20th century due to growing inheritance tax or death duties beginning in 1894 and economic downturns also affecting the expense of keeping a country house. So aristocrats and athletes alike feared the extinction of the country house, and it was in response to this that the Trust's country houses scheme emerged. So the country houses scheme came to really define the Trust for several decades, and a strong association with country houses remains today. This really began with Lord Lothian's speech in 1934, which he gave to the Trust, which is often credited as having inspired the scheme. He and other establishment figures who had 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 careers in colonial government and often owned country houses themselves, devised a scheme which would allow owners to transfer their property to the trust but remain in residence. So Kerr himself inherited Blickling Estate that you see here, which he later left to the trust. And he'd been working in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century and visited India in the 1910s. So throughout the trust's existence in the 20th century, you have lots of links to colonial government and people who were working in the trust or for the trust. And I just think it's important to think about how that would have been shaping how they saw these histories and thought that they should be thought about and preserved and presented by the trust. So as I said earlier, the 1937 Act allowed the trust to acquire these properties and their contents and without tax, basically circumventing the inheritance tax. And between 1940 and 1969, the National Trust gained 78 country houses. During this time, the trust emphasised that it did not want the houses to become empty displays, and most of all, it did not intend for them to become museums, and this distinction is made repeatedly in correspondence and promotional material. So part of the notion of the country house not being a museum was the idea that it remained a family home. This distinction between the country house and the museum was crucially linked to the arguments made to justify the continued presence of the family as an essential part of the house. It is implied that if the house ceases to be home, it will die, as Vita Sackville-West wrote, and that in turn, the history of the property will end. Owners could also provide a memorandum of wishes, laying out the way they hoped their houses would be maintained by the trust. Although these wishes are presented in a legal framework, they are not binding and are intended to be used as recommendations or guidance by the trust. All of this, of course, made the trust more appealing to country house owners and saw a huge transfer of property from landowners to a body intended to act in the public's interest. It also ensured that the history of the houses would be told for a long time in a celebratory way, with great deference towards the former owners. It is this tradition which Restore Trust seems to be pointing to in its insistence that the National Trust not alter its presentation of the past. No museum labels and no critical ideas about why the houses are there and who lived in them. Ever since the Country Houses scheme, the Trust has adopted more explicit museum practices, but it has continuously faced criticism when it does this, perhaps being seen to break the agreements that it had made with donor families in the mid-20th century. So obviously we can see that relationship with the debates that are going on today and how this scheme has shaped the way that the country house is presented by the trust. I'm really conscious that I don't want to overrun too much, so I'm going to really quickly go through some connections with America now. And if people are interested, I can always provide more detail later on or another time. But from its founding, I obviously mentioned the connection with America that the National Trust had. So its constitution was actually based on that of the Massachusetts Trustees of Reservations. This was founded in 1891 to protect and preserve outdoor spaces classed as having exceptional historic, scenic, or ecological value. So it's a very similar organisation, and it was the inspiration in part for the trust. And throughout its early years, the trust continued its relationship with the trustees and other preservationists and supporters from America, often being able to preserve sites with financial support from Americans or kind of campaigning together to preserve spaces specifically tied to American history. And this is often connected to ideas of ancestry. So things like places connected with former presidents of America or the American revolutionaries. And this continues into the 1950s, as seen in this example of Washington Old Hall. So it was opened to the public in 1955 and a lot of the support from America was its connection to the ancestors of George Washington. Washington never lived there. There's no actual kind of physical connection to him, but these ideas of ancestry and shared heritage was a really common term for it, were really popular across from the trust's founding well into the 50s and 60s at least. And this image is in the trust collections. It's just an example of something that would be displayed at the house. So this shows Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate in America. And something that's significant there, and partly why I've included it, is that in the 1950s, the trust continues to have these relationships with American preservationists. And as the country houses scheme is really cementing in the way it works and its popularity, the trust representatives from the trust visit America to meet with people from the newly formed National Trust of America. I think it's called the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and one of the properties it works with, or one of the organisations it works with, is Colonial Williamsburg. So they go and visit and share ideas, but part of what they're doing is going and visiting plantation houses, meeting with the owners of them, in a very similar way, it seems to me, as the National Trust is with country houses back in Britain. So there are some clear connections there in terms of how they're being preserved, and particularly how in both cases they're being aestheticised, and histories linked to slavery in particular, but also of empire more widely, are being sidelined or not talked about, particularly in terms of their historic significance and why you would want the public to visit them. So this is just a couple of images relating to that Colonial Williamsburg visit. There's some correspondence following the visit, I think it's in 1956, where people from the Trust and from Williamsburg are comparing these two houses. So it's the Governor's Palace at Williamsburg and Ashdown House in England, saying that perhaps the American building was inspired by the British one, which is an interesting connection in terms of there are all these ideas about genealogy and inheritance between Britain and America at this time, and from the late 19th century onwards, and that's kind of also being applied to these historic buildings. So really quickly, just my final slide before I wrap up is about Kedleston Hall. So this is the ancestral seat of Lord Curzon, who I spoke briefly about earlier. So he was born at Kedleston and inherited it in the early 20th century and did lots of restoration work on it, as well as the castles he bought and other historic houses he lived at and worked on. So this is now a National Trust property, though it wasn't donated by Curzon himself. It came to the Trust in the 1970s from his nephew. But it's a really interesting house for imperial and colonial connections because it was the inspiration for Government House in Calcutta. No connection to Curzon. This is happening 100 years before him at least. But there is this kind of happenstance that the buildings share these design features, and kind of shows how, obviously, I haven't really spoken about it today, but the country house has this massive influence on architecture across the empire. And then Kedleston being the home of Curzon, it's where he comes back to with lots of objects he collected on his travels. So he set up and designed a museum. It was formally put together after he died, but in the basement of Kedleston, you can go and see the museum. And it was originally the India Museum, but it has objects from across South Asia. And it's always kind of been maintained as this Edwardian museum, designed as he would have liked it. And it really tells us more about his travels and sort of his status, I guess, in India and about British government than it does necessarily about the cultures associated with those objects and where they came from. And the museum has been sort of reinterpreted over time, and there have been different exhibitions engaging with those histories. I don't have time to talk about it at length today, but there's an interesting thing going on with the Restore Trust criticisms, where the Trust has been doing this a long time, and for over 20 years they've been putting on exhibitions about the Indian connections at Kedleston, but there hasn't been kind of long-standing institutional change about how the house is presented. It's all kind of temporary exhibitions. So I think that's maybe part of why this hasn't become more widely known and kind of accepted as part of the Hall's history. But this certainly isn't new, as in the way that it's often been presented in the media. The Trust has been doing this a long time. And currently, my fellow PhD student, Charlotte Johnson, is doing loads of research on that museum. So look out for anything she publishes based on that. But just to kind of wrap up really quickly before we go to questions, obviously I've covered a lot of history very briefly there. But I think my kind of main contention with the debate around the National Trust that started in 2020, though has been going on much longer, as I've kind of alluded to, is that there became this kind of strange conversation that we were having about what was going on in the 18th and early 19th century and what was happening in the 2020s, with no sense of what really happened in between. So what I'm trying to piece together, and hopefully have done, is some of the connections between those time periods and kind of what was going on in between, and why the National Trust has always been connected to empire, but maybe not in ways that have made it so obvious. And it seems in many ways now the Trust is facing criticisms as it's becoming slightly more critical and distant from that history, having previously sort of celebrated it really, or at the very least kind of whitewashed it by not really talking about it and focusing on architecture and collections and landscapes. So I just think that this is really important context for this debate, and helps us better understand the National Trust as an institution and an organisation, rather than kind of, I guess, treating it as though it has always been the same thing, which I think is what Restore Trust and the media coverage is often doing. So yeah, that's it from me, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone who has any. Thank you so much.